Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Jamie Gruman and Akierah Binns. Jamie is a professor of organizational behavior in the Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph. Akierah Binns is a PhD candidate in management at the Lang School of Business and Economics, University of Guelph. Today, we will be discussing their research paper, a thematic analysis of how near-death experiences affect employees' work lives, which they co-authored. It's a great pleasure to have you both on my show.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
having us.
To start off, what are near-death experiences?
Akira, you want to handle this? Do you want me to take it?
I can jump in here for sure. So when
Okay.
we think about near-death experiences,
Yeah.
what we are talking about is close brushes that people have with death. And this might occur as a result of a car accident. It might also occur as a result of some medical emergency situations like that.
Mm,
Typically, what we see as a part of near-death experiences is that people may say they saw a light or they encountered a tunnel or an otherworldly figure. And these we consider in how we define and explain the features of what an NDE is.
okay. Okay. So I'm thinking that most of us have some near-death experience, like whether we kind of escape some accident. So I guess this is not something new, or is it something new? This concept.
Well, it's not new in that people have reported near-death experiences or NDEs
Yeah.
throughout all of history. You can find them reported in the ancient texts of every spiritual tradition.
Yeah.
It's new. It was sort of given a term in
Yeah.
1975
Yeah.
when it started getting studied systematically. But
Yeah.
so the phenomenon is not new, but
Mm,
the as a
Mhm.
subject that gets studied, it's
okay.
relatively new and
Okay.
easier. Well, never easy, but easier to study these days because of advances in medical technologies that make it more likely that people can be brought back from the brink. So there's an opportunity to report on things that in the past they wouldn't have been able to report on because they just would have been gone.
Okay. Okay. Very interesting. So why should management researchers care about these near-death experiences?
Go ahead, Kerr.
That's a really good question. So it was interesting the way
Yeah.
how we approach this. I think Jamie and I came at it from different perspectives. I just had an interest in like doing meaningful work and doing research that was meaningful and I thought that near death experiences was interesting. But what we found or what led us to think that this might be important is that when we look at the literature on near death experiences, we
Mm,
see that people report that this has profound life
mm,
changing
mm,
effects.
mm,
And we thought to ourselves, well, if this has profound
mm,
life changing effects,
mm,
then we don't really have a good understanding of what is happening when people have these
mm,
experiences. It's life
mm,
changing and they have to go back to work.
mm,
And we couldn't really find a lot of information about,
mm,
okay, what happens when you now go back to work with this
mm,
experience. And
mm,
so we thought that this might have implications for how employees respond in the workplace, how
mm,
employers, what the workplace is like, and how employers can respond to that. So this is important from the perspective of how it can impact other areas such as employee well-being, how
mm.
workplace contexts are set up and designed to support employees as well.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, let me just jump and add something
Yeah,
there. I
go
think
ahead, Jamie.
that
Yeah.
was well put. I think also, why people might be interested and concerned, or management scholars and practitioners interested in this topic is from both practical and for both practical and conceptual reasons. So practically, and as Akira was
Mm,
mentioning,
mm,
every economic system
mm,
has implicit and often explicit
mm,
foci on what we're doing, what important activities are, and how we
yeah,
should be investing our time and energies, right? And
yeah.
so it's possible, given the prior research on near-death
Mm,
experiences, that
mm,
seem to provide us with some potential insights
mm,
into how we should be living our lives.
mm,
They might also be giving us some insights into how we should be
mm,
organizing our economic lives. So, it was one of the
mm,
things sort of practically that might be of value, but then also
yeah.
conceptually. So this work came out of
Mm,
my broader program of work that focuses on consciousness. Right? So NDEs give us some potential insights into what consciousness is. And this is one of the questions that drives me. I mean, it's as old as time, and I don't pretend I'm going to be coming up with the answer anytime soon, but it's just interesting to consider, right? As scholars, we should be getting right to the edge of knowledge and thinking about what does it mean to be this thing, right? What are we? We don't know. And so studying, what consciousness is to me is very interesting. And so studying near-death experiences can potentially give us insights into what it is. And, if you consider in the West, we tend to think that consciousness is just, an epiphenomenon that comes out of materialism. We have these physical bodies, these brains, and consciousness comes out of that. But in other parts of the world, in Hinduism, consciousness is considered fundamental to existence. In North American indigenous cultures, consciousness exists fundamentally on par with physicality. Everything is conscious, they believe. And so these questions are more conceptual, but in my mind, some of the most important things to consider if we're going to understand how we should be investing our time and living our lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just wondering about this near-death experiences. Some of the people I met, and again, it's just anecdotal because just few people I talked to, they said that after they come across this near-death experience, like especially if they have those experiences, their priority changes in their life, for example, and what was important then before that experience is no more important anymore. Is this something you've also noticed in your research?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because for example, maybe their goal was to making a lot of money. Most of us want to work hard and make good living, but then that expense comes in, they realize, well, money is important, but now they want to spend more time with their children, with their family, things like that.
Yeah,
100%.
This is maybe one of the most important and interesting things that came out of this study. I know Akira is going to jump in also, but this is just such a, I was talking about our economic systems and how they orient us towards certain objectives. Most of us grow up to varying degrees, but we grow up believing that success in life is about making a ton of money and having a big house and having the latest phone and having a boat and a car and going on vacation. And one of the interviews, I'll never forget, one of the interviewees in our study said to us, all the things that we think are important over here are not important over there. And all the things that are important over there are not important here. And so that really gives me pause. Really, if I think about, the ethics, business ethics, and how we're supposed to be, how should we be conducting ourselves, right? I always ask, what are we doing? What are we doing, right? We have this whole economic infrastructure set up, and it's sort of self-perpetuating. You don't need to think about it. It's just going to carry you away. But if we take a minute and think about what we're doing, and is this the best way we can live? We have the choice to, right? We should be the economy should be working for us, not the other way around. Sometimes it seems that we're stuck in this economic system that doesn't promote flourishing and thriving. Well, if we take a minute and think about how we should be living, we can make better decisions about how to structure our economic systems and our businesses. And if we want to not only be stuck in ideology about how to do this, it's possible that people who have new insights as a result of experiences that most of us don't have can provide us with some ideas about some changes that we should be making in order to promote the thriving and the flourishing that I think we all want, but I think sometimes actually don't think we can achieve.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, do you have some stat like how big that near-death experience segments are?
Yeah, so about 4 to 8% of people overall have an NDE. And among specific populations like cardiac arrest patients, between 10 and 23% will have an NDE. So it's actually pretty common.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It is.
I'll tell you this. What got me originally started interested in reading up on this was about in 2018. I read a book by David McGinley called Beyond Surviving: Cancer and Your Spiritual Journey. David is an interfaith counselor at a cancer hospital on the East Coast. And I read his book. We met. We had a Zoom call, and I was a little incredulous. I'm like, I said to him, like, "Oh, how often do these NDEs occur, right? Like, so he would tell, in his book, he talks about hearing from cancer patients about these NDEs that they're close to death.
Yeah.
And I said, well, how often does it happen? Like maybe once, two, three times a year, you'll hear about these stories. He's like, no, Jamie, every week I hear stories about this. And that really got me thinking there's got to be something to this. What exactly it is, I don't know. Akira and I spoke about this all the time. We don't know what's happening, but they're relatively common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know for your research, you conducted a study. You did some qualitative study. Would you share what did you do for this project?
Yeah, absolutely. So we used purposive sampling. We thought this might be the best approach. And so first we approached the International Association for Near-Death Studies. So there's an association of people who have had near-death experiences. And so we initially made contact with them, as well as the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, and asked them to advertise our study. And then we also posted on social media sites like Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Reddit, because there are communities of people that have near-death experiences in these spaces as well. And so we received like almost 90 expressions of interest in our study, which was really, really surprising.
Yeah.
But good in the sense that people were interested. But we had, to cut down the number of participants because we had like a specific list of criteria. We used the near-death experience scale. And when we administered those questions, then there's like a cutoff mark that we use to indicate based on the literature that yes, this was a near-death experience. And so when we did that, we had about 14 individuals who we spoke with. So we did semi-structured interviews with them. Jamie was the lead on this part, and we had an interview guide which asked them primarily. We asked them first to tell us about the NDE. What was their experience? What was the cause of it? Did they see the light? Were they in a tunnel? Were they forced to come back? And then we followed that with the questions about work, like how did they think it affected their work life, their stress levels, their motivation, these kinds of questions. And so based on that, of course, after that, we looked at all the responses that our respondents had given. And then we started our process of coding. So we looked at it broadly first, and then we discussed and we went back and forth all the time, looking at how what is the meaning that these respondents wanted to convey. So we took more of a constructivist approach to that, and we developed about 6 themes we had for our study. And so it was an interactive and iterative process.
So you said you interviewed 14 participants. You come to this number because you realized that there's no more insight, or how do you decided that 14 interviews? Because you have 90 interests, but you chose 14. What was the reasoning for selecting 14 participants?
The reason we originally were shooting for I think 12 or 13. There's a paper that we found that it's interesting. It's an empirical summary of saturation, which suggested that at 12 or 13, if you're looking at a relatively narrow topic, at 12 or 13 you reach saturation. So we were shooting for that number. We got 14, so we were happy with that.
Yeah, wonderful. I just want to ask you experience, because now you're talking to these individuals who had this near-death experiences. What was the experience like for you?
It was life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very humbling to be invited into what are these among the most intimate experiences of people's lives. We had a number of them where people were just crying and just they were so overwhelmed, just recounting to us the experience, and it was just so meaningful, and for most of them just such a beautiful experience. So to be part of that was really, you can watch videos on YouTube, you can read books on this, but to have somebody, like we're speaking right now, where they're sharing with you for you their experience was very moving. And Akira, what were your experience?
Yeah, it was really, nothing that I think we could have anticipated how meaningful it was for people to be so willing to share that with us. I think what resonated with me about this part of the experience was the fact that people were saying, we're so happy that you're actually talking about this. We've been experiencing this, or we have experienced this for how many years, and we're just now coming to terms with it. We feel validated that you are looking at this because it shows that my experience was real. And I think that was one of the important pieces of having these conversations and doing this research, was giving these people a voice to talk about their experiences, because we saw too that sometimes when they had these experiences, they were very hesitant to share because they didn't know if other people had experienced it. They didn't know if other people would understand what they're talking about. So it also gave them a space to express that, and express that in a meaningful way. So that resonated a lot.
And something else that we spoke about a number of times between us and with the participants also is by sort of giving voice to their experiences and the after effects of how it affected their work. We thought if we put this out into the world, it might influence other people and be of value. It wasn't just research in the sense that we were gaining insight into some phenomenon, publishing in the paper, and we're done, move on to the next study. It was potentially very, very meaningful and actually life-changing. And it only came out recently, but already, I was on a Zoom call 2 weeks ago with a woman who emailed me because we did an interview and she heard about the interview on CBC and got in touch with me. So I heard you. I was crying because she had an NDE and she was having trouble with it. And so we spoke for about an hour. And I mean, what a perfect example. And she felt better after I gave her the name of David McGinley, who does counseling with people who are having trouble, and gave her a bunch of books. So what a perfect example of exactly what we were hoping would happen as a result of one of the things that could happen as a result of this study is that it can affect other people and make a positive difference in people's lives, and it's happening already. So it's really wonderful.
I think talking to academia in a non-judgmental fashion and confidential discussion, I think these discussion, you talk with you, very important, because I think sometimes people are very hesitant to talk these experiences to family members, to friends, because we don't know how they react. But I think you were listening to them, help them to really open up, and perhaps you may be one of the few people they're really opening up their experiences.
I think the people who chose to sign up for the study were those who were willing to talk about it. So what I would hope is that people who've had NDEs who might be reluctant to speak about it for a whole host of really valid reasons, because even this woman I was speaking with recently was talking about how some people just ridicule you. They think you're crazy, and some people interpret it in a very negative way. And so if you don't get support in talking about it, you just learn to clam up. And historically, that's what most people did. It's better these days because the topic of NDEs is a little more in the public mind. But even then, it's something that's difficult to bring up.
Can you share what did you learn from your study, the results of your study?
Yeah, we can touch on some of the themes as we were talking about earlier. One of the major themes that came out across all participants was the reprioritization that you spoke of earlier, where they shifted their attitudes towards work and towards their careers. Some of them even lost interest in those external measures of success that we were talking about. One person said that they were a salesman. They were very good at being a salesman before. It was about getting the fancy cars and everything. And after that, he was like, this is not it. And he sort of focused more on building relationships. So it was not just a client in and out. So we saw reprioritization. We saw that it impacted relationships. It transformed how people interacted with those that they worked with. It caused attitude changes among them. Some people who were working in professions that didn't align with how they now saw themselves quit those jobs. So we saw where people quit those jobs. They were like, I don't want to spend my time doing nonsense. I want to do something that is meaningful to me. And so they specifically expressed that I could no longer do that job because it was not in alignment with who I was. And so these are some of the themes that we saw coming out, some of the major ones. Jimmy, do you want to touch on any others?
Yeah, I'll just add that so the first two themes that we noted in the paper, I think help to contextualize why these other changes occurred. So the first one was insights and new realizations. So part of the reason people had these reprioritizations and changed jobs potentially was because they learned, for example, that they claim to have learned that consciousness survives death, and that's a big deal. So when you learn that, you realize that the short amount of time you have in your material body isn't as significant, or in some ways is more significant because you have an opportunity to make a difference. And so when you learn that we are all one and that everyone has an individual purpose, which are some of the themes that came through in this first theme, it changes you. And that's the second theme. The second theme was personal transformations, where people talked often about becoming much more spiritual. It's interesting in the literature and in our study also, some people become more religious, but most people become less religious because they find religion too constricting, and they claim to learn that all the rules and the lessons about you're going to be judged when you die and you're a bad person, you have to turn around and be a good person. It's not true, they argue. They claim to have experienced firsthand the truth of a more spirituality, and they've claimed to have learned, and they've been personally transformed because they've learned that the dogma of the religions is, it's a human interpretation of a more fundamental reality. And, if we put it in the broader context, if every religion is just one interpretation of the broader reality, we can consider that the broader reality is what's real, and each religion is simply like a game of broken telephone, like every group having their own way of thinking about things, but ultimately it's all the same lesson. In the literature on what's called perennial philosophy, Houston Smith discussed this as all the different religions as being different paths up a mountain, and depending on the path you take, you see different things, you see different animals, you see different plants, but they all reach the same summit. And at the summit, everybody looks out from the same vista. And so this is what they claim. It's not the way they described it, but if we broaden it to other literature, this is the essence of what they have learned. And so they became less religious in recognizing that we're all one. So these two themes, the insights and the personal transformation, sort of set the stage for why they just couldn't work the way they were working previously. And they became much more loving. They became much more interested in relationship building. They became, I want to say they became less interested in material things, but that's not a strong enough statement. They almost completely lost interest in material things. One person said, I don't want to go live in a cave and just stare at my navel all day because, I still have to eat and put food on the table. But, one said, would I like $1 million? Sure, but I'd probably give it away because it's, I don't need it. I'll give it to people who need it more than I do. So those were, the lessons that they claim to have taken away are so fundamental, and they feel it in their bones. I just do need to say, there are skeptics, right? I don't know if we're going to be getting into this, but there are skeptics. There are people who say, look, this is just brain chemistry. This is just at a traumatic moment in time, parts of the brain that are normally inactive become active, and neurotransmitters just overwhelm synapses, and that's all that's happening here. There's nothing mystical. There's nothing spiritual going on. And there's a ton of people who write about this, and this is one, the materialistic take on it. And so I actually, in one of our interviews, I just finished a book, Waking Up by Sam Harris, who discusses this. And so I said to the interview, I said, if Sam Harris was here on the call right now, and he said to you, this is just brain chemistry, you didn't experience what you think you experienced, what would you say to him? And she said, without missing a beat, she just said, I would just ask him if he's ever had one. And if not, just shh, be quiet. So yeah, it is such a
Yeah,
if it's true, I think as academics,
yeah,
part of our job is to investigate the possible.
yes.
Our task is not to
Mm,
confirm our pre-existing ideas of the way
mm,
things are. Our task is to
mm,
venture into the unknown.
mm,
And so we need to recognize
mm,
our own worldviews, our own
mm,
perspectives,
mm,
and question them. And so in this research, we're not taking a stand on what is real
yeah.
or not. We're absolutely respecting the fact that everyone who took part in our study
Mm,
firmly believes, without a beyond a shadow of a doubt, that their experience
mm,
was real and that
mm,
they touched another dimension of reality
mm,
that most of us don't fully respect that. I haven't had an NDE. Akira hasn't had an NDE,
mm,
so we can't vouch for that.
yeah,
Um, but as scholars,
yeah.
we're willing to recognize
Mm,
that the paradigm that we're using to understand reality may be wrong. If you go through history, everything we thought in the past is wrong. And if we go further into the future, everything we think today will be proven wrong at some point. And so maybe our ideas that the brain and consciousness is simply an emergent property of, or the consciousness and an emergent property of the brain
yeah.
may be proven wrong. So let's
Mm,
consider that.
yeah, yeah. Very interesting results you got. What are the managerial implications of this research?
I really love that our research focused on like the what happens after the NDA at work, because when we were
Mm,
talking about this,
mm,
Jamie and I, and we
mm,
considered this question, we
mm.
sort of were like, well, what's new about our
Yeah,
work?
yeah.
But we brought it back to when we look in the literature, we see that workers want to satisfy three fundamental needs. They
Mm,
want economic security, they want
mm,
to do meaningful work, and
mm,
they also want high quality relationships.
mm,
And our results really suggest that what happens is a shift in the priorities among these three things,
mm,
where the drive for the economic security
mm,
becomes less, it's the one at the bottom, and
mm,
then meaningful work and having authentic relationships are
mm,
elevated. And
mm,
so I think that has really, really important managerial implications for how employees navigate the workplace and how
mm,
employers set
mm,
up the workplace to support their
mm,
employees who've
mm,
had these experiences. And also for those
mm,
who haven't had these
mm,
experiences, there are some lessons that can be taken
mm,
away as well in terms of what
mm,
motivates us, what are the success factors that we're defining,
mm,
and how should we focus on well-being
mm,
in the workplace.
mm,
Anything to add, Jamie?
Yeah, I'll just add that that profile
mm,
of increased interest
mm,
in relationships and meaningfulness and a decreased interest in material things is the same profile that promotes well-being. So these days, workplace well-being is all the rage. People are very
yeah,
interested in promoting workplace well-being.
yeah,
So the people who have had NDEs, the changes in their lives, in their work lives afterwards, parallel what the literature tells us promotes well-being. And so
mm,
organizations that are interested in promoting workplace well-being are well advised to listen to the experiences of those who've had NDEs who seem to be
yeah,
ahead of the curve
yeah,
in figuring out how to promote well-being.
yeah,
And um, how to achieve work-life balance and
yeah,
how to have sustainable careers over the
mm,
long term
mm,
and focus on what matters.
mm, yeah,
I tend to think of the implications in terms of
mm,
organizational culture, like
mm,
organizational purpose and organizational culture.
okay,
But I don't want to be overly sanguine about this. There's another study done years ago looking at uh, marriages in which one
mm,
marital partner had an NDE and the effect it had on the
mm,
relationship. And the overall effect was not good. And I
mm,
think 60% of those marriages ended in divorce because they were unable to connect afterwards. And
mm,
so the idea that if people learn about NDEs, all of a sudden everyone's going to be focusing on what matters in life and not worrying
mm,
about promotions and becoming executive vice president anymore and
mm,
spending their time building relationships. I think that might be a little bit overly optimistic.
mm,
So, the implications of the NDEs. Look, we're talking here about,
mm,
if these are real, we're talking about
mm,
a paradigm shift
mm,
in the way we understand what we
mm,
are and what we do economically and
mm,
in work.
yeah,
That's not a change that's going to happen quickly or easily, and there'll be a
yeah,
lot of strife
Yeah.
but going from X to Y,
Mm.
a lot of change management potentially. And so I don't want to
Mm.
paint too rosy a picture here
Mm.
and suggest that
Mm.
even though the implications of these
Mm.
NDEs in the workplace
Mm.
are potentially very significant, I don't want to suggest that they're necessarily going to be easy to implement because it's swimming upstream. It goes
Mm.
against the
Mm-hmm.
way we
Mm.
typically think of
Yeah.
work, and more fundamentally, the way we
Yeah.
assume what the assumptions we make about ourselves. I mean, Ed Schein, talking about culture, discusses how, at the bottom level of culture, these basic assumptions,
Yeah.
they're unspoken, they're unexamined, and they often
Mm.
produce violent opposition when they're questioned because they make people feel
Mm.
uncomfortable. And
Mm.
that's what's happening with this type of knowledge. So
Yeah.
important, yes. Easy, no.
Yeah. Yeah. What is your advice for future research on this topic?
Well, I have to say this was a one-off.
Mm.
Empirically, it
Yeah.
came out.
Yeah.
We did it partly because I was working on another paper, a conceptual
Mm.
paper,
Mm.
that was discussing NDEs as sort of a link in a chain of a story I was telling.
Yeah.
And we just did one. I had some research funding I had to use
Mm.
up, so Akira took it, and I have a number of ideas for future research,
Mm.
including things like the implications for leadership. I'm
Mm.
curious about the implications
Mm.
of NDEs for the self, just
Mm.
generally. The self is implicated in so many areas of organizational life.
Mm.
But it's interesting, you think of Buddhism, and they talk
Mm.
about there is no self, it's an illusion.
Mm.
It's not the same idea we have in the
Mm.
West. Um, but then, and this is what I find interesting about these NDEs, right? It's not ideological. It's not people,
Mm.
it's not competing views on the nature of reality. It's all these people, for no matter where they are, all throughout
Mm.
history, have the same types of experiences. It's not ideological. And what happens to their sense of self when they have these NDEs? What happens is they don't disappear. And
Mm.
so, what does that suggest to us about what
Mm.
the self is?
Mm.
Then we also have to, it gets complicated. So, we also have to
Mm.
accept the fact that if we assume that these NDEs are real, people are touching another dimension of reality.
Mm.
Uh, that doesn't mean that the dimension they're touching is the end of the dimension. It may go on, and maybe at some point the self does disappear, and maybe the
Yeah.
experience they have is completely different.
Mm.
Uh, days are, I don't know, time is
Mm.
amorphous in the other realm, but
Mm.
in colloquial terms, days or weeks or
Mm.
months or years
Mm.
down the road, maybe their experience changes. So
Mm.
we may just be catching a glimpse
Mm.
of this other dimension if it's real. Um, but it's still, all we can do, the only thing we can do is to sort of peer into the abyss and see what we see. And so looking at the self, I think it'd be also interesting to look again at the biological correlates. They're not
Mm.
necessarily causal, but the
Mm.
correlates of these NDEs and implication and interactions with other fields such as physics to better
Yeah.
understand what's going on here. I think those are some of the areas of future research we should be
Yeah.
investigating.
As well as the
Molecular.
negative effect as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because most of
Mm.
the people we spoke with had positive NDEs. Maybe there are
Yeah.
about two people that didn't have
Yeah.
a positive NDE, but the negative effects might also have other implications aside
Mm.
from what we found or examined in our study. So it'd be
Mm.
interesting to look at
Mm.
that in comparison, perhaps as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me just add really quickly, if any of your viewers are
Yeah.
considering, so NDEs, some people, I think Bruce Grayson is someone who says that near-death experiences are spiritual experiences, and they're no different from other spiritual experiences. And so some of you viewers might be thinking, well, let me engage in meditation to try to have,
Mm.
a spiritual experience,
Mm.
which is great, but you need to go into that with open eyes.
Mm.
It's common for people who meditate and practice mindfulness,
Mm.
particularly when they get better at it, to
Mm.
have negative experiences. I just finished reading a
Mm.
book called Kundalini
Mm.
by Gupta, I think.
Mm.
And the whole book describes the overwhelming negative experience that he had after meditating for his whole life.
Mm.
He one day had, an awakening, Kundalini
Mm.
awakening,
Mm.
and it almost killed him. And so in the workplace spirituality literature, people tend to focus on the good stuff
Mm.
when it
Yeah.
comes to meditation and mindfulness. I just recently
Yeah.
published a paper on mindfulness discussing the potential negatives. And we
Mm.
need to acknowledge, we need to go into this with our eyes open and recognize that the spiritual journey is bumpy, and it's not all good. The end result may be fantastic, but getting there is hazardous and potentially life-threatening. So, as Akierah said, research on how to pursue this path fruitfully and effectively and healthfully is important.
Yeah, nice. What's next for you, Akierah and Jamie?
I wish we have more
But
collabs in the future because we make a great team. But
we
outside of
do.
that,
Yeah.
I will be continuing on my PhD studies, looking
Yeah.
more so on the HR side of things at layoffs, and who knows, I might explore NDEs in relation to layoffs and that kind of tangent in the future. But for now, I'm just focused on finishing my thesis and
Nice.
continuing my program of research.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
I'm just going to get on as many of Akira's committees as possible and fail her so she can't leave. So she has to stay here and work with me forever.
Very good. Thank
No,
you so much.
I'm just.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry,
So
Jamie,
please
go
go.
ahead.
I was just going to say I'm going to continue my research and my work in consciousness. That's really the stuff that's floating. I'm old now. I'm tenured and I'm full professor. I don't. I've put in my time, and now I'm going to spend the rest of my time investigating the stuff that I find really interesting, going back to my roots and sharing with the world any insights that I might come up with. So and doing this is part of being able to accomplish that, sharing these insights. So thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time and sharing your very interesting research. Wishing you both all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Thanks.